This is a reading that came up in the assignment for Beloved Conversations this past week, and it's written by our very own Reverend Margulies, so it seemed like a really appropriate reading for when you were talking, Penny. It's called Prayer for While in the Struggle. Spirit of light and love, spirit of resistance, spirit of generosity, that which serves as our conscience in this work that we do to dismantle white supremacy, to empower the marginalized, to insist that Black lives matter. We have been angered, we have been saddened, we have been pushed to the brink once more. We are also inspired and seem resolved to do better this time, to not simply get to the other side of this moment, but to get there actually healthier, morally healthier, to get to a safe space for Black bodies. Spirit, help us to understand that we each have a role in justice work, for our liberations are tied to one another's. Give us the clarity of mind to know what our individual part is in the struggle, that there are many ways to protest injustice. Help us to find our way and commit to it. Spirits, we ask for guidance. Send us strength and endurance. Help us to give our all to this and hold nothing back. For precious lives depend on it. We will be imperfect. Rest assured that we will mess up over and over again, and we must do it anyway. May we summon the courage to tear down this system of injustice and get busy creating a world community with justice for all. May it be so, and amen. So Penny Quill, welcome to Elder Tree, and I'm going to mute myself and you go.
Okay, well, thank you, Libby, and everyone for being here today. I have to tell you, here I am repaving memory lane. I've never, this is really the first time that I've really had to think about and write down my life in a linear way. So it's been kind of interesting for me as, you know, too. I was born in central New Jersey in a very small town. It was really just a stop on the railroad called Belmead, New Jersey. And Belmead had a general store. The post office was attached to it. There was a lumber yard and a butcher shop. And the Central Railroad of New Jersey stopped in Belmead. So there was also a big grain mill there, which was kind of a gathering spot for farmers. My maternal grandparents migrated to Elizabeth, New Jersey in the late 1900s from Germany with 5 children. And 3 brothers, 3 of my grandfather's brothers, returned to Germany at the start of the First World War and never returned. My paternal grandparents arrived on Long Island in 1630. My father was forever proud of our family genealogy. We had officers in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and my great-grandfather fought at the Battle of Gettysburg. Needless to say, I don't have to tell you, I don't share the family's white supremacist pride in any way. Even before I was aware of my own feelings about white privilege, my father made every attempt to get my sister and I to belong to the Daughters of the American Revolution, which gives me the creeps, and the Daughters of the War of 1812. My father was born in 1907 in Ridgefield Park, New Jersey. His parents had an extremely unhappy marriage. My grandfather died of pneumonia. He became ill and died within a week. And my dad was 16. My grandmother was a devout Lutheran, She was never far from her Bible. She didn't allow alcohol or social gatherings other than her family. I do remember my grandmother. She would come to visit us. She would begin every meal with a very long prayer and remind us that bread was the staff of life. My mother had a particularly cold relationship with her. So family visits were few and far between. And my mother, when my grandmother came down with dementia and was placed in a nursing home, my mother never went to visit her, and in fact, never even went to her funeral. My mother was born in Paterson, New Jersey, to a very strict authoritarian German family. My mother was sent to Austria when she was 16 to go to school, and my grandparent, and so she was never that close, I think, to my grandparents either. In fact, our whole family, I don't know any of my cousins particularly well. So we never had a sort of a close family in terms of cousins and aunts and uncles. My grandparents were very formal. Good manners were expected very early on in our childhood. We were expected to stand up when adults came into the room, and we had to curtsy. So it was very formal. Good manners were the most important thing in the world, I think, to my parents. On the other hand, we loved my grandparents very much. We always looked forward to their visits, and we would visit with them frequently. So they were very good friends of ours. I love them. My parents, who came from a very kind of privileged backgrounds, shocked and disappointed my grandparents, their families. When my parents decided to move to Mexico, when they were married in 1932, they went on the road. They had an old Ford, and they drove across the United States into Mexico, and they lived in Acapulco for about 6 years. They lived on the beach. I have no idea how they didn't work. I think that they partied a lot. They probably did odd jobs. You know, these are one of the many things that we always wish we had asked our parents and never did. They returned to New Jersey and settled in Belmead in 1939. They bought a small farm, about 150 acres, for $2,000. The outbuildings on the farm included a barn, a machine shed, a corn crib, a pig shed, a brooder shed for baby chicks, because every year in March, they would arrive. We would get 1,000 baby chicks, and they would come in these huge boxes, and they would go into the brooder house, which had a big sort of lamp where they could stay warm. And if chicks died, they were fed to the pigs. I mean, the pigs got everything. So my father, and also the house didn't have any indoor plumbing or electricity. And so this was in 1939. My father has always been a bit of an enigma to my sister and myself. He didn't know a thing about agriculture. It would be as if probably any one of us in this room had to survive by farming. But he did, his higher education was in finance. Rutgers University, which was in New Brunswick, which is probably 20 miles, I guess, from us, had an ag course. And so he learned what the rudiments of farming, and he learned enough to manage a working farm. I was born in 1941, and my sister was born in 1944. In the 40s and 50s, central New Jersey was a rural farming area. Most of the area was settled by the Dutch in the 18th and 17th centuries. And many, many of the farms had been in the same family for hundreds of years. There were the Strikers, there were the Van Pelts, there were the Van Cleefs, there were many, many Dutch names. And there were also lots of Revolutionary War sites, because Belmead was about 10 miles from Princeton. So there were a lot of history, a lot of folklore. We lived about a mile from the Sauerland Mountain, which is basically a ridge, but it was called a mountain. And Hessian soldiers who escaped from the British Army would hide in the Sauerland Mountains. The Lundbergs had a house, and that's where the baby was kidnapped. And Eugene O'Neill had a summer house also in the Sauerland Mountains. So the whole area had a lot of interesting stories about it. I grew up on a dirt road. I went to a one-room schoolhouse until I was in the 7th grade. Our phone number was 404J2. I love that. It was a party line. And our one neighbor, because we were very isolated, when she was listening in, of course, we could hear her clock ticking. So we always knew when Mrs. Brokaw was listening to our phone calls. As kids, my sister and I learned to drive a tractor. We milked cows, we collected eggs, and generally entertained ourselves, because we didn't have any, there was really no friends around or kids our age. My mother would take us for very long walks during pig slaughtering time in November. We would take our farm products to Flemington, New Jersey, where there was a very big farm market. We would take chickens or pigs to sell. My father went every week. We had an old Ford Woody. And I have some wonderful photographs of that car. And there was no floor in the front seat. My mother, let's see, we had no TV at all until we were teenagers. And my dad loved books. He had a big collection of books from his father and of his own. So reading anything and everything was really the way we sort of learned about things. We also listened to the radio. And I think those of us of a certain age will remember some of the radio programs that we listened to. Stella Dallas. We listened as a family to The Lone Ranger. So that was really our life as children. The bus would pick us up and drop us off. My sister went to one small school and I went to another small school. On the other hand, my description of our lives on the farm sounds really bucolic and lovely and everything, but in many ways, our lives were impacted by my mother's very frail emotional health. And my dad was really our primary parent. At very young ages, my sister and I were sent away for the summer to camp. And later on, we were sent to boarding school. So, we were away a good deal of our childhood, either in the summer and then later on when we went away to school. But my parents, you think of them as sort of early hippies and back to the land and so on, but that's not really the way it was. I mean, my father supported us with farming, certainly, and he worked 7 days a week, as farmers do. It was very hard, but they never gave up their kind of societal expectations for my sister and myself. My parents' friends were almost entirely well-to-do folks who had moved out to that part of New Jersey because it was lovely and rural, and there were also beautiful old houses, and there were always occasionally, you would have a Washington slept here little plaque on the house. There was a lot of drinking. There were a lot of big parties. and a lot of excessive behavior. So there were really two sides to my folks, especially my dad. So when I started high school, my parents sent my sister and me away. Boarding school was something that was beyond a farmer's income. And my dad, through family connections, went into banking again, and went to work for Chase Manhattan Bank, and became a vice president like right away. My sister and I have spent hours trying to figure out how that possibly could have happened. I mean, that was a career move that would never happen now, certainly. I mean, it could have happened in those days because of the old boys network. I mean, this was in the 50s. But he became vice president for Mideast affairs, primarily Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and Bahrain. He traveled a great deal, took my mother with him. But we were away at school, so it really didn't matter that they were gone a good deal of the time. We suspected that through family letters that my father might have been involved with the CIA. I mean, he certainly led kind of after he died, when I was going through his library, I found letters, and also he had a close relationship with Oliver North, and he was a staunch Republican, very, very conservative. He was also part of the subculture of, oh, you know, some of my best friends are Jewish, you know, kind of guy. So I think you have that picture. Boarding school was a small Episcopal girls' school in Bedminster, New Jersey. It was run by the Anglican Order of St. Luke's. The school was definitely responsible for my thoroughly, and I must say lifelong, antagonism about religion. In my senior year, I experienced emotional abuse from the priest who lived with his family on campus. Harm that came from that experience.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Wait a minute, something's happened with my...
That. Could you try again?
Quiet. Sorry, did you all hear? Well, you must have heard that was Siri somehow popped up on my screen. So I don't know where we were. I guess while we were talking about boarding school and a very unpleasant experience I had with a priest in my senior year. And in those days, I did report this to the Mother Superior, who really called my parents, and everybody got very upset with me. And it was kind of just brushed under the rug. So I have never gotten, in some ways, really past that. Let's see, went on to college, and I will also say that my feelings of anti-authority, I think, really came from that experience when I was a senior in high school. I went on to college. I went to the women's division of the University of Virginia, Mary Washington College, but I dropped out in my sophomore year because of a pregnancy. My parents, as you can imagine, were, there are no words for how horrified they were. I sort of had the 50s expectations of, okay, you can go to college, but it ends there. A good marriage, and have children, and that would be it. But that's not the way things turned out. And my parents, well, they just were not supportive and very upset. I did have a miscarriage. My mother took me to Princeton Hospital to the emergency room. My father was traveling and told them that I had a heavy period. And I was not to mention at all, of course, that I was having a miscarriage. So on my 19th birthday, I applied for a job as a flight attendant with United Airlines. I can best describe those years as my holly-go-lightly years. I lived in Manhattan, in Pittsburgh, and San Francisco. Back in the day, when you were a flight attendant, we were weighed every month. Appearances were extremely important. We weren't allowed to work anymore after we were 30. And things were, once I sat on the pilot's lap when we were landing in Buffalo, because everybody thought that would be kind of a hoot. Those years were really fun, I have to say. They were very social, very superficial. And other than showing up on work on time, completely irresponsible. When I was living in San Francisco, I would go to New York when we were flying in New York, and I remember going to Bonwit Tellers and buying a hat and writing a bad check for it, knowing I could get back to San Francisco before the check got to the bank and bounced, and then I would get home in time to put money in the bank to cover the cost of the hat. So, that's kind of the way we lived. The dark side of those years was poor judgment and too many parties. I had an abortion in Mexico that went badly, and I wound up having a severe pelvic infection that ended any hope that I had to bear children. Following a marriage in San Francisco, I moved to Cincinnati, Leesburg, Virginia, and finally to Rochester in 1970. In 1967, my children, two children, Andy and Chrissy, were adopted. Following a divorce, I moved from Pittsburgh into the city to Westminster Road with my 5-month-old and my son, Andy, who was 3. I had no higher education, no skills. So I was kind of faced with the prospect of how we were going to survive. I had the great good fortune to live right across the street on Westminster Road from Mariana and Bill Toller, who were in the process of starting what was then City Newspaper. And Bill and Mariana put this paper together in the attic of their house. They invited me to become their advertising manager, of which, of course, I had zero experience, except I did love to talk to people. They had a letter press in the attic, and I remember, literally putting, I don't even know how, someone I'm sure knows about this, but putting letters in, to make sentences and so on. So I would put my kids in a stroller and we would walk up and down Park Avenue. This would have to be every week, Monroe Avenue, and knock on doors and get people to put ads in City Newspaper. It was really, it was kind of an interesting time, I will say. So let's see, where am I here? I'm losing track. So I'll skip over a very short second marriage, except to say that most of it was spent in London on a year-long sabbatical. Andy and Chrissy went to school in England, and we spent one whole summer in Greece and another summer in Italy. Coming back and being faced with raising 2 very young children as a single mom and no education or skills is daunting, to say the very least. My parents never really disowned us, but their anger about my sort of going off into left field, they never really accepted that, I guess I'll have to say. I was kind of the black sheep of the family. My sister, in the meantime, a little aside, she graduated from high school with boarding school, and she went on to college, lived in Manhattan for a few years. She made it her whole career in publishing. She moved to London in like 1968 and has lived there ever since. And she's now retired, but she sort of got away from everybody and lived in London. But I was here and I was kind of the black sheep. I cobbled things together, however, and went to MCC and got an associate's degree in nursing because I figured that was really the quickest way to get a career and get a job. And I transferred then to the U of R School of Nursing and got my bachelor's and my BSN. During, we had clinical rotations and this, a psych rotation, an acute care rotation, plus we had a rotation in community health. And that was kind of the great kind of Shazam moment in my career. And I'm also taking a look at the time. Okay. My very first patient was a woman who lived on J Street in the city. And I remember driving to that building and there were no numbers on the building. And this was a maternal child health visit. And so I knocked on the door and I wasn't even sure if that's where she lived because there wasn't a number. And she answered the door and I walked up the stairs and walked into this apartment and I just knew right away, this is what I wanted to do. It was just, I loved it. I loved being in the apartment. I loved meeting her. It turned out that she had a mentally disabled brother that she never told me about, who was kind of confined to a bedroom in this apartment. So it was, and of course she had her baby. She was single. She was 17. She was very young. And so she was my kind of patient for that entire clinical rotation. And I also discovered that I loved working in urban neighborhoods. I worked for the Monroe County Health Department when I got a job. And the county was sort of divided into a pie shape. And so the top of the pie would be in the city and then spread out into the suburbs. But most of my cases were in the city. This was also during the years when they were mainstreaming psychiatric patients from RPC living in the community. And we nurses would help support those folks who had spent most of their lives at RPC. And that, I just found that great. I mean, these folks were all over the place, really, really interesting. And it was, it was a good time for me. And I felt that I really had a purpose. Also, the other reason I went into community health was my kids were growing up and I could swing home and check on them. They were latchkey kids in many ways, but at least I didn't have to work weekends and I worked primarily a 9 to 5, so I didn't have shifts. Race and people of color, I had, of course, in my growing up, you can imagine, no experience whatsoever. My mother, however, had a cleaning woman who lived in Princeton. Her name was Elizabeth, and she was African American. And Elizabeth would come out once a week and clean house for my mother and do ironing for my mother. Later on, I'm just going to skip ahead, but just a little sort of vignette. I had got to know Dr. Gail Harrison, who some of you do know from Rock Acts. She's an African-American woman, and we really had to carve out our friendship. I got to know her when we were doing sacred conversations for the Unitarian Church. And I was the kind of helped get this put together with Baber AME, and Dr. Gale is a member of Baber AME. And she was not particularly interested at all in what we were doing at First Unitarian. And we had a conversation and she said, well, tell me about your life. And I said, well, you know, I grew up on a farm. And she said, well, did you have any exposure to people of color? And I said, yes, my mother had a cleaning woman. And she looked at me and she said, you mean to say that you lived on a farm and your mother had a Black cleaning woman? She said, I just don't understand that. She said, and I never will. And again, of course, that's white privilege. You know, it just never occurred to me, but it certainly occurred to Dr. Gale that that was a very good example of white privilege. The great gift, I think, of community health nursing was, especially when I was working in the city, was you're in people's homes, you get to know the family pets, you get to know the plants, you breathe the air, and you begin to hear stories. And so I felt really comfortable because I got to know people with our African American community. And that was a very, you know, it was just a really good experience for me. And I think it certainly helped me get to know folks and just, you know, folks who were raising families and going to work and, you know, making dinner and doing all the things that we do. And so I really found there was really I didn't really then, I would have to say, and this, of course, we don't have time today for me to talk about race, but certainly I haven't been aware of white privilege up until the past probably 5 years. 10 or 15 years ago, I never thought about that. It didn't really occur to me, but what it did do, my community health nursing, was establish a total and complete comfort level. I mean, I have friends who live really down in neighborhoods who, to this day, I go to their houses for dinner, they come here. And so well, at any rate, we can talk, maybe at some other time we can talk about this. Still, white privilege was something that I haven't even had to struggle with, but I certainly have worked very hard to become aware of, I guess. I had one elderly gentleman who I visited for a very long time, who lived in subsidized housing at University Towers. And he had cancer. He had an ostomy, and I had to go every week and help him with ostomy care. And the humiliation for him, I can't imagine, having a white nurse come in and do intimate care with him. He was a very dignified, lovely man, but absolutely hated those visits. But we became, over time, and again, this is a great gift of community health, friends, and at least learned to trust each other. And he told me that when he was a child, he was forced to watch a friend of his tied to a tree and burned to death. And I will never forget that story. I met Tim, my husband, when we both worked for a hospice program. I was recruited by Genesee Region Home Care Association from the health department to become director of their certified hospice program. And Tim, we met cute, you might say. Tim was a medical director, and of course we had meetings every week, interdisciplinary meetings, and that's how we met. And we got married in 1991. As adults, I think we all know what goes round comes round. And we wound up caring for my parents. My father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and my mother was very frail with various emotional problems. She had macular degeneration. So they sold the farm in 1992, and we moved them to Rochester. They refused to go to a senior living community, so they bought a house or a condominium in Fairport, and I was their caretaker. I had also the good fortune of being able to retire, so I could do this. Most people don't. They take care of their elderly parents while they're still working and raising kids. I had permanently lost contact with our son Andy in the early 90s. He had married a Filipina while stationed. He was in the Marine Corps, stationed in the Philippines. Our granddaughter Stephanie was born in the Philippines, and following a great deal of red tape and attorney bills, we were able to get Maria and Stephanie to the United States. They settled in California, and when Stephanie was 18, they never divorced, they just left each other. Stephanie and Maria, her mom, vanished. This part of the story is very painful. They were both using drugs, and we had an intervention with Andy that resulted in his permanently cutting us out of his life. This was in 1993. So after the death of my parents in 1993 and 2002, we reconnected with Stephanie and Maria. That story, which there's not enough time to tell you that story, although it's quite a story. But I'll skip all of that to say that Stephanie moved to Rochester when she was 15, and she came to live with us, and I became her legal guardian. She was quite damaged, as you can imagine, very angry, and not in any way interested in living with us. She really didn't want to, or attending a traditional high school. So I found a hero therapist, finally, who Stephanie trusted, and had the brilliant idea of enrolling her at MCC, where she finished high school. Slow but steady wins the race. She became part of our family. She graduated MCC with a 4.5 average and got a full scholarship to Ohio State University. And she lives in Columbus. She owns her home. She's a graphic designer and just an amazing woman. She really is one of the most resilient human beings I've ever met. And I think because we had to carve out our relationship, we are extremely close. We love each other in a way that only in the way I think that took an incredible amount of time and a huge amount of faith. But, getting trust from her took years. It really, truly did. My daughter Chrissy married, and some of you know this story. She had 4 children, and she became a nurse manager in the trauma unit at URMC. She's bright, beautiful, very driven, but suffered from undiagnosed bipolar disorder. In 2008, she attempted suicide and suffered a permanent brain injury. She lives pretty independently, I say pretty independently, in a senior community, the Legacy at Clover Blossom. I've taken over the mom role that with Chrissy's kids, who are now in their mid-20s, birthdays, boyfriends, girlfriends, holidays, and just general overall support. I think being a grandparent, they're much more comfortable with us, with issues and pain and joy and sorrow that they've had to endure. When Chrissy had her injury, her youngest was 14 and her oldest was 19. And that was in 2008. So it's been for us, you know, there's always, I'm not a Pollyanna, as those of you who know me very well. I'm very irreverent and skeptical about things, but this turned into being, for Tim and I, a wonderful, rich experience in many, many, many ways. In the early 80s, I went to a workshop at the Zen Center and became a member of the Zen Center and was there for many years. I think Zen made a great deal of sense to me. It was accepting who I was without words or intellect. I loved the ritual in Zendo. I went to, and my connections with the Sangha became for years a major part of my life. Philip Kapleau was my spiritual teacher, and Tim was his doctor when he was at the end of his life with Parkinson's disease. And I just, when my children were going through such suffering, I found a great deal of peace at the Zen Center. However, I came to the Unitarian Church. I'm going to talk fast because I realize we're reaching the end of our hour. Was after Chrissy had her injury. You know, I really wanted a spiritual community for us as a family. Tim was never drawn to Zen practice. And for Chrissy, it just wasn't a practical community for her. So I was very familiar with First Unitarian through my friends. I had gone to workshops there over the years. And so I joined up. I guess I've been a member, I think maybe for about 9 or 10 years. I've came primarily because of social justice. My years working in the city and community health and volunteer work at Rochester City School District and AIDS Rochester really made me very aware of the inequality and segregation. And I could also bring my Buddhist values with me. So it was a win-win all the way around. I served on the Social Justice Executive Committee. Roberta Buckle, my dear friend, and I merged the Criminal Justice Ministry with ROC-ACT's Criminal Justice Task Force. But we are now passing the banner to our younger and more capable hands. So we're in the process of doing that. Libby has guided my spiritual life through Wellspring, for which I am forever, ever grateful. And I love all of our community so much. And I can't wait till we can just get back to going to church again. So that's it for me. Thank you for listening. And I hope it wasn't too boring.
Oh God, Penny. Too boring is like the last thing I can imagine. And because I know you, I have loved hearing the chronology because I know pieces of this story, but putting it together has been great. And I know that you could talk for another 3 or 4, 10, 20 hours and we would never be bored. But I am going to take the spotlight off of you and invite people to raise their hands if